Welcome to Spirit Level, the podcast that explores spirit, mystery, inspiration, and the ancient art of divination through the lens of modern living. I'm Jamie.
And I'm Fiongal.
And we're your hosts. In this podcast, we have a mix of guest speakers asking what spirituality means to them, talking heads between Fiongal and me, our experiences, what's helped us along our paths, and what could inspire you, and maybe some meditations along the way. So welcome. We are back with another episode. I'm here with Fiongal.
Hello.
And this week, we wanted to dive into what happens in a reading.
Dum, dum, dum.
So for some people listening, they may have never had a psychic reading, never had a healing, never had a past life regression. So,
and I think even those that have, there can sometimes be an air of mystery of how do we do it, what goes on before, and all of
the
that.
behind the scenes almost.
BHS, as the cool kids say.
The BHS. So
British Home Stores, RIP.
So yeah, what?
It's BTS, isn't it? Whoops. We're not cool kids anymore, are we?
Too old.
Dum.
Well, I am.
The BTS, behind the scenes.
Oh dear.
Anyway.
Behind the scenes. Yeah, so what? I'm going to ask you a few questions about how you kind of set up your readings and what people might expect from a reading with you. So just briefly explain to me.
Yeah.
Like, give me an overall view of what happens in a reading.
So we might look at a little bit more. I might explain a little bit more what I do beforehand.
Yes.
The
actual reading.
There's a little bit of prep, and then the client will come and we sit down. And then I always start with what I call the housekeeping. So the housekeeping has kind of been developed over time. And I understand that when people come, it can be a bit like, come on, Fiongal, just get on with the reading. Why are you telling me all of this stuff? But what I found is anytime that I skip the housekeeping, the expectation of what the client wants and the way that I work, it doesn't match up. So there can be a bit of a mismatch or a misalignment. And that's when I run into issues. So typically, I kind of check in with people, whether it's their first time or whether they've had a reading before. Because, you know, as we're going to explore today, there tends to be quite a lot of misconceptions or kind of misunderstandings of what it's going to bring. But typically what I say within that housekeeping is, again, a lot of this is quite idiosyncratic. So the way that I'll work isn't necessarily the same way that another psychic will work. But one thing that I really encourage is that people record the sitting. So they're able to listen back later on, because sometimes the things that I will be saying have absolutely no relevance to the person right here and now. Mm-hmm. But on later listening, they can go, okay, that's why that theme kept coming up, or, oh my gosh, that's who Brian is, or whatever it might be. So we'll do the housekeeping and then we'll start. And again, as part of that start, there's kind of three main things that I say. One is, and again, we'll probably delve a little bit deeper into this, but one is that I don't work as a fortune teller. Nothing about a reading is about predicting the future. Okay, so sometimes I might look at the most likely outcome, we'll look at future aspects, but the future is always dependent on our actions, our decisions, and our beliefs. So, you know, there might be certain checkpoints that we're somewhat destined to reach, but we can, through our own volition, for our own free will, avoid those checkpoints. Then I'll also explain that people should only ever take the information that I'm giving if it aligns with what their intuitions and what their instincts tell. Otherwise, it would just be dogma. So if I say to somebody, oh, you have to do this, well, who says? A, I might be wrong. B, spirit might be wrong. And actually, if it's not in alignment with what you want, then that's no good. And then we begin. So again, for the first half, I do what I call a stream of conscience. So I just channel whatever information is coming through. So I tend to work with a blend of psychic art, an aura diagnosis, tarot cards, mediumship, and then psychic work. And hopefully we'll be able to unpick all of that. But I'll blend all of those modalities and then start to look at every aspect of somebody's life. Unless, of course, they're coming and they're saying, I want you to look at work, or I want you to look at this specific situation. But usually within an hour, we tend to look at, as I say, every aspect of your life. So that will include finances, romance, home, work, all of the usual stuff, really. And then I'll leave some time towards the end for any questions that they might have, any direct questions. How is my new book likely to be received, let's say, or whatever, anything that I've not had an opportunity to cover in the first half, or anything that they want me to kind of explore or delve deeper into. So that's generally the structure. But one thing that I always remember my mentor saying is that the beginning of the reading should be the same, the end of the reading should be same, but nothing in between should be. And what that means is it is obviously so case by case. If I ever find myself repeating some of the messages or guidance that I've already given before, then I know something's
that's interesting.
kind of gone wrong.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, this is too simple. There may be on the rare occasions, there was a similar situation that arose in my reading last year, but you shouldn't ever feel like you're control copy, control paste really within your readings. Again, sometimes my guides will show me an image or a symbol that I have in my repertoire that they use occasionally, but the actual scenario shouldn't necessarily be exactly the same. It shouldn't be a carbon copy of.
Are there things that perhaps you say to give the clients that confidence that you are talking about them? Like, are there things you need to do in order to prove that you're psychic? Like, is that the evidence?
Yeah, yes and no. So mediumship and psychic work is slightly different. So mediumship is where you bring through the evidence of a loved one. So
right.
That usually is, maybe that's a relative, maybe that's a partner, maybe that's whomever it might be that is spirit side, who has passed, who is no longer with us on the earth plane. And the old school way of working with mediumship is 3 pieces of evidence and then the message. So in a sense, yes, it's no good saying, I've got a woman here and she's got blonde hair. It's just like, what? Well, it can be anybody. But if I'm saying, I've got a woman here, she's got blonde hair, she works, she seemed to work in medicine, she seems to always kind of twiddle her thumbs. These kind of idiosyncratic little nuggets that will show to the sitter, they've definitely got that person. And the same is relatively true in psychic work. So sometimes I've given information that is so on the nose, like, your mother grew up in Coventry or something like that. It's just something that I could never guess. But what I have to be mindful of is that I don't get caught up on, that's what a good reading is. Because a reading isn't for me to understand, it's for you to understand. Right. So I always know when I'm doing really well in a reading if I have no idea what I'm talking about. Right. Because I know that I'm not trying to kind of guess or I'm not trying to add up the dots too much. So if I'm just talking, and it takes a lot of courage and that takes a lot of faith. Sometimes I talk about the most obscure stuff that I really expect the client to kind of go, what are you on about? But actually when I give pause and give breath, they're like, oh my God, this is so relevant. So it's a bit of a kind of a fine balancing act, because I don't want to get into this place of, I have to get the middle name of their favorite pet, and it's because then you start getting in your own way. But we are taught in training that you should always give enough evidence to somebody that they know that you're talking about them, that you couldn't be talking about anybody else. But sometimes the messages are a little bit abstract. They are a bit generic, because my guides, the cards, don't want to necessarily pin things down to such a degree that it becomes an instruction manual. Does that make sense?
Do you think people do come with a preconceived idea of how the reading's going to go or what they want? And can that influence and affect you? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, does the outcome change in terms of what that person brings? Is it important how they are, how they present? Is it important if they talk to you during a reading, or would you rather them be quiet, for example? Or what is it that they can do?
So, yes, it does make a huge difference to what people bring to the table. Part of it is I always liken it to meeting somebody at a party, let's say. So if you go up to somebody at a party and go, oh, hello, my name's Fingal. How do you know the host? I almost said ghost there. Which is quite fitting in my field. How do you know the host? And if they kind of go, it's not a conversation.
No.
And then I'm very likely to go, oh, wow, okay, that wasn't very fun, and then move off. The same is true in a sitting. Although the client might not be speaking necessarily, there is a degree of openness or politeness or kind of affability. And if that's not there, then it's like, why would I want to try and kind of really kind of create that connection with you?
There's nothing worse, is there, than sitting in a reading and the person's just sat there with their arms crossed and they're just like, go on, impress me.
Absolutely.
Show me your best.
Absolutely. And over time, I know how to manage that, because if you were doing that, I said, do me a favor, can you just uncross your arms? Can you just sit up a little bit? So it is as much my job to kind of hold space and create the right environment. But 9 times out of 10, that is coming from fear. Or that is coming from, I don't want to shift my beliefs.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes that does come from, right, show me how good you are.
Yeah.
And the great thing is, because I've been doing this for so long.
The great thing is I am good, so it's fine.
Your words, not mine, Jamie. But the great thing is I've been doing it for so long that affects me less and less and less and less. You know, I am human. It's still going to have an impact, but it probably doesn't throw me off as much as it perhaps did when I was initially starting. But of course, those clients that come that are very warm, are very open. And that's not about being gullible. That's not necessarily about kind of believing in everything I say. That's not what I'm saying. But it's just a kind of, just a bit of a connection, a bit of...
It's like you always say, and our tutor... I bought my mum for Mother's Day a reading from our tutor at the College of Psychic Studies. And I remember him saying, oh, it's the worst reading when you're a gift. When you're somebody's present, it's the worst thing. A, because the expectation is there already. You're like, you really want to do good because somebody has gifted that. And secondly, sometimes the person coming hasn't asked for it. So they're usually the ones that sit there with their arms crossed, because it's like, well, I didn't choose this. So have you had instances where people have come as a present and it's been challenging?
Yeah, we do, because obviously we've got gift cards on the Wellness Foundry. So that is a kind of thing. Thankfully, I've never had that many bad experiences. But yes, it's what I normally find is it's when the girlfriend or wife, not exclusively, I'm not being a misogynist, but, you know, that typically is the way that it lands, wants someone to whip the boyfriend or husband into shape. And they can't say it themselves, and they're like, oh, we'll just send you to a psychic. So that can sometimes be difficult, because it's like, well, I'm not here to tell you what to do at all. There are instances where I do have people kind of going, I don't know why I'm here. And that is a little challenging.
And also you said sometimes in some readings, I remember you saying there isn't much to say because there's not much going on in their life at the time. So if you're coming for a reading and you are, you know, average Joe Blogs, or you go to work, you come home, you've got your family, and you don't do much else, and you're happy in your job and your family's good, and you come for a reading, it's like sometimes it's quite difficult to read that, right? Because it's there's not much going on.
Yeah, completely. Because usually 90% of the time somebody's coming because they're either at a crossroads
Yes.
or they're trying to make a decision or they're frustrated or they've lost their direction or something. There is a kind of, it's not always about issues and problems, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but yes, you've got some meat to work with, definitely. And, there's absolutely nothing wrong with kind of leading quite a kind of normal, the ebbs and flows of similar from day to day. You're completely right. Sometimes it's difficult to know where I'm always looking for the grit or the gristle.
Yes.
And trying to sort that out. And if there isn't that, it can sometimes be a little bit confusing. I think, where do I kind of look out for? But, again, this is one of the big misconceptions about readings, or probably the biggest, is I have a lot of people when it's their first time reading is, don't tell me anything bad's going to happen.
Right.
And going back to your earlier point, part of the training, I can't remember if you said that this episode or last episode, but a lot of the training is about how to deliver messages with compassion, because honesty without compassion is just brutality, right? So it is, any time that we're looking at maybe a difficult time or a difficult situation that is coming up, our job is to talk as much about how to navigate that and how to best, what the best outcome might be from that challenge. It will never be, I've had so many people come to me and say, I went to see another psychic and she said I'd break up with my boyfriend. And I'm there thinking, well, how can that not be self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yes.
If somebody plants that seed in your head, then you're going to then look for all of the scenarios and situations that back that concept up. So we're never about, this will happen. And particularly if we're looking at troubling times or challenges, right, where's the lesson? What's the lesson in there? And how can we best navigate it? Also, the important thing is we look as much as what is working well. So looking at the qualities within a person that, spirit are commending you on your compassion, spirit commending you on your determination, spirit commending you on the amount you look after others, whatever it might be. It's about as much as kind of examining your best qualities, your virtues, as it is about, right, let's make the adjustments where things aren't perhaps as aligned as they could well be.
Just going back slightly, you're talking about self-fulfilling prophecies. That's like me in one of my first psychic readings I ever had. So I'm still waiting for this to happen. He told me I would have a suitcase of money under my bed, a very big suitcase of money. That has stuck with me. Is that a self-fulfilling prophecy? Is that what you're talking about? Something that somebody planted a seed? But this is quite a positive thing, I suppose, because he planted the seed that success was always going to be something on the cards for me. He was symbolizing the money as not necessarily a suitcase of money stashed on my bed, but it meant that there was going to be financial success for me. But it's something I've always thought of and remembered. And it's why, in a way, for example, I don't have a pension, because I think, well, I don't need it because I'm going to be a millionaire.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like, because that is often one of the questions that I get asked is, are people only kind of placing prominence or importance on what you're saying because it makes sense to them? And I'm thinking, well, does it matter?
Right.
Yes, probably. But it's a bit like if you and I watch a movie, there are going to be bits that you remember and really are poignant and jump out for you and to you in that movie. They're going to be completely different to what's important to me. And it's much like a reading.
Yeah.
You should only identify with what resonates and inspires you and goes, okay, yeah, this is going to happen. And it's that thing where thought goes, energy follows. So Is it a negative thing that you think, right, suitcase full of money, that's where I'm going to place? But it is that thing we have to be careful and mindful of. If it can go that way, it can also go the other way.
So we've talked a little bit about the psychic, the mediumistic work. You said you did spirit art as well. I'm interested for the listeners to hear about what maybe a spirit drawing or a spirit session with you, a spirit artist session might be like.
So yeah, there's kind of the three other elements that I mentioned is the aura diagnosis, the spirit art, and then the tarot.
That's right.
So in terms of the spirit art, again, for those that have heard the first episode, and I've spoken about a little bit in my history, I used to work in fashion, but was particularly loved fashion illustration, something that I want to go back to at some point. And there is a natural, because again, something that is not commonly understood is my spirit team, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about the spirit guides and spirit teams either in this episode or another episode. They will often use what's already there. So if you've got gifts, if you've got aptitudes, if you've got a skill set, they will use that. Why wouldn't they? So I've always been interested in art, loved drawing from a very, very young age. So within some of my psychic art sittings, it tends to fall into one of two categories. One is spirit portraits, where I draw the portraits of a loved one. So be that a husband, be that an ancestor, and give the evidence around it. And that has been with the most remarkable results. Occasionally I've drawn an image of someone and they send me a photo of who I've drawn and holding it side by side. Even I'm kind of, I can't get too caught up, because as soon as you start thinking, well, I'm great, I'm marvelous, I'm really good at this, it's all going to go to shit, really. So I have to kind of not get too hung up. But, there are still times, even today, I had a reading maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that I was giving evidence and somebody was relaying back how it related. And I was just absolutely gobsmacked at the accuracy of it. So again, it's important that we stay out of the way in that respect. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that I draw symbols. So as again we spoke about previously, I like to call myself a seer. So I receive kind of images, impressions, symbols, and I draw those symbols for people. So it might be, for example, of a pair of scales, let's say, and the whole message is around bringing balance into their lives, or might be identifying their fairness in all matters, however it might be, and drawing that and then giving it over as a memento, as a kind of talisman to kind of constantly remind them of that aspect. So it's really nice, particularly for those that are visual, to have that visual message, because not all messages have to be about your aunt loved lavender and wore pink dresses necessarily. They can just be. What I like about the symbol readings is it's much more around pointing towards the moon rather than looking at the finger, so to speak. It's like it's a direction of something, not something that's too kind of gross or obvious. And then in terms of the aura diagnosis, again, it links fairly similarly, because again, it's a very visual thing for me. So usually kind of eight times out of 10, I'll start the reading by looking at somebody's aura. So that's the energetic extension of where somebody is. People might have seen those photographs with the coloured blobs around them, and that's pretty much what I see. And from that, I will start describing their kind of personality, their aptitudes, what their daily lives might entail. So, for instance, if somebody's been doing lots of yoga, their aura might look a particular way. If they've been doing lots of accounting,
right,
their aura might look a particular way. So it's slightly strange.
So that's like because we talk about it in this world as having a way in.
Yes.
So a way in is a place where you can kind of a comfortable place where you can start from, and it's a good place for you to it's just easy for you to get into. So yours is definitely, because I think your visual, the colors, the aura works really well for you.
Totally.
But it could be completely different for somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the tarot, for instance, are people's ins. It's just wherever there's it's whatever helps you establish a connection with the person that's in front of you.
Yes.
Yeah. And some people, there's lots and lots of different ways to do that.
So do you use the tarot in every reading as well? Or?
Kind of. I'll probably get done under the Trade Description Act, because I think it says that I am a tarot reader on the website. And I do. It was my first love. It's how I got into the world of psychism and mediumship. And I do, people that come to me, I always say, I'll lay some cards down, but I may or may not talk about them very much as we go through the sitting. So some sittings I talk about almost every card.
Yeah.
And then in some sittings I almost ignore them. But I do absolutely love them. It just, again, I'm careful not to get too caught up on the method.
Yeah.
Because if I try and unpick that too much, it starts to get, in a way, clunky. So it's very much case by case.
Right.
And again, with some clients, I work very retrospectively, and there's a lot of kind of wistful information. So talking a lot about, when you were a child, you loved to do this, and when you were with your husband, you loved doing this, and when you, a lot about the past. Some people, it's very much about the here and now, sorting out the issues that they might be facing in the present. Or for some people, it's very future-based, because my guides or the cards are trying to give them inspiration or clarity about what could be. And kind of, you could have managed this, you could achieve this. And so it's very dependent. And I don't dictate that. Spirit does, and the cards do.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Spirit Level, brought to you by the Wellness Foundry, bringing spirit to soul. Looking for a trusted and industry-leading place for spiritual wellness? Then the Wellness Foundry is for you. Listed in Time Out and Evening Standard as one of the best wellness hubs in London, they offer one-to-one tarot psychic readings, energy healings, luxury retreats, mystic teachings, and a range of beautiful products to clients all over the world, all with a down-to-earth, accessible, and non-dogmatic approach centered around balancing mind, body, and soul. Use code PODCAST5 at checkout and enjoy 5% off your first booking with us. For more information and bookings, visit the website wellnessfoundry.co.uk or find us on Instagram at Wellness Foundry. Terms and conditions apply.
What happens? We spoke now what happens in the reading. Could you explain what happens before the client gets there, and also what you do afterwards? So again, in this world, we call it opening up and closing down, right? So could you just give the listeners an idea of how that works?
So this is probably something that, again, we might pick up at a later date in greater detail, because it is a big,
massive subject.
Massive subject. And actually, again, you've mentioned it previously, this is a lot of what the training's about.
Yes.
And I see time and time again, those that work in this field that haven't had that training, haven't had that grounding, haven't had that foundation, getting into quite a lot of trouble, really. A lot of the time people say, so when you're at a party, do you kind of, the first time I meet somebody and say, what do you do? And I say, I'm a tarot reader and psychic. And I say, are you picking up anything on me now? And I'm saying, no. The way that I describe it is like having a taxi cab go around London, and when the light's on, I'm ready to pick up the passengers, but when the light's off, leave me alone. So it's a similar thing like that. And actually, it's all about spiritual hygiene. So if you're not opening up and closing down properly, a lot of the time what happens, particularly as we both are enormously empathetic, we take on
other people's crap.
Exactly. It's like, it's basically, the other way that I say it, it sounds a bit kind of clinical, excuse the pun on what I'm about to say, but it's a little bit like a doctor preparing for surgery, washing the hands, sterilizing the space, getting everything ready, performing the operation, the reading, and then afterwards again taking off the scrubs and kind of clearing down from that.
A good analogy.
It's really important that we don't try, and this is something I had to really, really work on. It took me years to accomplish this, not to try and fix people's problems for them or take their stuff on to try and balance them out. Or one thing that I really noticed that I was doing was kind of cogitating on the reading for hours afterwards, and I've realized that's no good. So in the opening process, I like to take at least 15 minutes, sometimes more. I can do it in 10 in a pinch, but I like to take at least kind of 15 minutes, give or take. And that's just an opportunity for me to cleanse the room, cleanse the space. And again, that's just done with a visualization. Some people like to use sage. We have a fairy aura spray that's used for the purpose, but it doesn't really matter too much.
It's intention, really,
exactly.
Isn't it? A lot of the stuff, a lot of these processes, you know, you can do it, but with a word. You can do it with the thought. It's intention. That's what we're doing. We're creating intention. It's like when I teach a yoga class, I say at the beginning, set an intention for your class. Set an intention. Why have you come here today? Because without intention, right, we don't move. We don't have any drive. We don't have a place to go.
Totally.
So I guess it's
totally
similar.
Yeah, it's a bit like people waving smudge sticks around. Unless the intentions behind it is kind of, you might as well be waving a hot dog. It's
yes.
It's kind of, so it is exactly, and normally ritual is about focusing intention. So you have that ritual of opening up. You have that ritual of cleansing space. So I always cleanse the space first. Mm-hmm. Then I'll do a meditation that is about opening me up energetically, what we sometimes call opening up the chakras. But just it's about getting into a still state, about coming into the present, becoming embodied, becoming grounded, and again with intention, as you've so rightly said, about opening ourselves up spiritually and energetically. I mean, there are more mechanics to that,
yes.
but in its kind of grossest form. And then I will call in my guides, my spirit team. And again, we might explore spirit guides in further depth because it's a huge subject.
Yeah, we'll definitely do an episode on spirit guides for sure.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. So send your questions in if you have any, and we can answer them. But I'd invite my spirit team in. So I have different members of my team for different parts of the reading. So I've got a spirit guide that helps me with mediumship. I've got a spirit guide that helps protect my energies. I've got a spirit guide that helps me on my psychic art, all of that stuff. So I'll call them in, protect my own energy as well, get that in a kind of nice secure bubble, and then I'll start the reading. So that again is about a kind of 15-minute process. And then at the end of a session, I will clear the energy again. One habit that I really enjoy is washing my hands, because it's that old idiom of I wash my hands of you, which isn't about me kind of discarding my client at all. I'm hugely invested in making sure that they get something out of it. But it is about me then saying ritualistically through action, right,
It's like a cord cutting almost, isn't it? Because you have tuned into somebody's energy. So
totally.
You can't stay connected to that person's energy. Otherwise, you imagine the amount of readings you do.
Totally.
It's like by the end of the week, you're going to be connected to all these people.
And I've had to learn that the hard way. And it's still something I have to work on. I'm much, much better than I am.
And I know I'm not great at it.
But you've seen me at times be just no good to anybody. I'm depleted. I'm exhausted. I'm emotional. It's taken me you've seen me after a rough reading.
Yeah.
And I'm distraught.
Yeah.
There's been a couple of times where I'm like, right, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to quit. Like, this is no... And that, again, has taken real practice and real trust and real faith. And it's something I've actually added recently to my readings, and it's literally over this week. This came through on a mushroom trip. It dropped down. But I now start the reading saying, thank you for being so brave to come and sit here in front of me. And also recognizing that it's really brave of me as well to put me in a situation where I'm sitting in front of complete strangers most of the time. And it's really brave because they're kind of exposing themselves. They don't know what's going to come. They're putting their trust in me, and then vice versa. It's like, we're really both taking a huge gamble, a real punt. Again, that reminds me a little bit of a lot of people tend to ask as well, who do you most like to read for? Is it kind of, can you read for friends? Can you read for family and the like? I always say my preferred, it's a close kind of tie for first, is a complete stranger or somebody I've read for once.
Yes.
I don't quite know which I prefer. I quite like a returning customer for the first time because I know at least I've got something right that they've come back. So it takes the pressure off a little bit.
So already you're feeling confident.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the more that the client returns, and I've got lots and lots of repeat clients, and I don't normally say that. I don't say this to them, and it's fine. It always works out okay. But there are times where I go, what am I going to say?
Yeah.
Or thinking, well, I got things right last time, but maybe I'll get it all wrong this time and they'll think I'm a charlatan and a fraud. Yeah. So a lot of that. But yeah, the more you get to know people, the more difficult it becomes. But I have read from my family members, read from my mum a couple of times, read from my sister. I think close friends are quite difficult because you are obviously always going to be slightly coloured by what you know about them, but it's no means impossible. I have still done it. It's
funny, isn't it, though? Because people always assume the opposite. They assume if you know them, it's going to be easier. And this is the thing. It's like, well, no, we're not actually talking from our mind. This isn't us, It's the opposite. It's so much easier. For me, I find it really hard even on a second reading with somebody because especially if I can remember. Often I can't remember because you don't. But on occasion, like in training, when we're at the college, you do read for people week in, week out. And then sometimes it's the same people. I really struggle with that because the easiest place for me is on a clean slate because then I know I'm not getting in the way. I know it's not coming from me. I know it's coming through spirit. Whereas when you know somebody so well, sometimes the distinction of is it me or is it spirit can be quite a blurred line.
Completely. I actually have an anecdote around this because when I first started out, I used to go to people's houses to read. I don't anymore. We've got this beautiful studio in Vauxhall at time of recording. That's why I like people because, again, we can make sure that this place is energetically set for the purpose. But I remember when I first started out, I went to this man's house, really, really lovely guy. And I sat down and I saw a card on the side that said, Dear John and George. Not their real names. I can't remember their real names, but it said something like John and George. So halfway through the reading, I said, is it mainly menu date? Because I'd seen this card. And he kind of looked a bit taken aback and a bit confused and said, no, I'm straight. And later it transpired that George was his dog. So it's one of those times where you really get in your own way. You start making assumptions. The worst thing you can do in a reading is make an assumption or try and kind of connect things too much.
Yeah.
And that, again, takes an enormous amount of faith.
It's like something we both do in a reading is we don't tend to look at the client. So you always state that at the start of a session, don't you? Now, look, I'm not being weird. I'm not ignoring you. I'm not like thinking about other things. I just find it much easier when I'm looking away because it's unhelpful in a way to have them looking at you. Like you said, you can see a frame behind them of something and it just distracts you. And you don't want that part of your mind to come in. You want it to be completely spirit-led. And the easiest way to do that is to kind of either look away and just have those images coming from that place.
Completely. And then you're not too distracted either by them frowning or nodding or smiling or anything like that. You just want it to come through. And again, to go back to your earlier point, was because it's really important, is at the end of a reading, when the client's left, I forget almost all the content.
Right.
So if somebody comes back, I say, I know I've read for you before, but I remember almost nothing of what we discuss.
Yeah.
And usually people assume that's because I read for lots and lots of people. And in a way it is, but actually it's much more to do with the fact that it's using an entirely different part of the brain. So again, that's why if people come to me and start trying to ask questions on the mechanics of a reading, I would say, let me do that at the end because I'm gonna have to use my thinking brain and my memory brain too much, and it's gonna interrupt.
What is it that you do to close down? And I see you doing this in our kitchen all the time. And I keep saying to you, will you show me what you're doing? I mean, we all have different techniques of closing down, and I have one, but I like yours because you do all this squiggly thing with your hand or your finger. And I'm always like, what are you doing? Can you describe what you're doing?
So, yes.
Is it a Reiki thing? I get the sense it's...
No, it isn't a Reiki thing, but I can see why you would go there because, in Reiki, we do sometimes use symbols. So it's a similar thing. Again, it's just an intention thing, really. It is a pentagram. It's a 5-pointed star.
Oh.
And you draw it in a
see.
particular direction, and one direction opens and the other direction closes.
And you do that for each chakra?
And then I do that for each chakra. So
Okay.
I work it from the top down. So I'm drawing in my energy. I don't know if you remember this, but when we first started dating, when we first started going out, we couldn't go on the underground for about 18 months or something.
It was a nightmare.
I remember you getting really, really frustrated.
I was talking to you and you'd be like...
Just in everybody else's conversations, I would be so overwhelmed. I'd find the noises too deafening. The whole thing was sensory overload. And that was part of me not closing down properly.
Yeah.
So again, this is something that I've really had to train myself on. And a lot of people say, oh, isn't it? But don't you want to always be open? Don't you always want to kind of be receiving information? Absolutely not. Because when you're doing that, you're making yourself energetically exposed. So it's really, really key. And even, again, if anybody's listening and they think, well, I do feel a bit kind of open or a bit kind of I'm getting empaths overwhelmed or whatever it is. Again, all you need to do is with intention, draw your energy in. So what we typically call the aura, bring it in the front, bring it in the back, bring it in the sides, above, below, and just bring that in nice and tight. And again, I tend to wrap the outside of my aura in a particular color. Very, very dark blue works for me. And again, it's just about setting that intention of that taxi light is now off. I'm no longer for service. Because again, imagine if I was just brushing my teeth and spirit started talking to me, or it's all about boundaries basically, and it's about cleanly setting out those boundaries.
How often should people come for a sitting, or a reading, or a healing?
It's a little bit how long's a piece of string. It really is a case-by-case scenario. What I say don't do is sometimes an easier answer is don't read a hop. So don't go to one psychic, then another psychic, and then a kind of another reader, and then a medium in too short a space of time. Now, that's not to say you can only go to one reader and that's it, you set for life.
That's usually because people are not getting the answer that they want, isn't it?
Completely. And actually, all that will happen is you'll end up more confused than you went in.
Yes.
Because what they'll say might differ slightly from that, or it's from a different perspective, or, they actually both say exactly the same thing. So you think, oh, well, I have to do that. So you just have to be slightly mindful that you don't kind of... For me, I obviously have slightly more readings than I do ordinarily because I'm either interviewing people or I'm training or... So I tend to have quite a few readings throughout the year, but typically I would go to a reader maybe once or twice, maybe twice a year, 3 times a year, anywhere between that. Slightly depends how much...
You go more than that.
Well, I do now because, again, part of it is it's a little bit like... part of it's not market research, but it's about
training,
more
training. Yeah,
seeing
that's
how
true.
Other people do it.
True.
So if I wasn't working in this field, I'd
That's
probably go once or twice a year.
Yeah, because we get we're lucky enough that we get test readings for people that want to join the team.
Exactly.
They will
all
read
of
for
that,
us.
All of that. And
true.
I might be doing a guest sitting and all of that. So I do have lots of regular ones. But I always say, whenever you have more questions, it's a good time to go. Mm-hmm. And as long as you're not, as you so rightly said, wanting to look at the same thing and expecting different answers, that's when it becomes problematic. I know people that do it in change with the seasons, which I think is quite lovely. So it's just about finding a rhythm that works for you. That said, I have on occasion just said to people, look, there's so much here. It's so dense and so compacted and there's so much we could get out of this scenario. I'd love to see you next week. And they book in next week and we look at an entirely different subject. That's very rare, but it does happen. It's also why I've started coaching, doing spiritual life coaching, but for those people that actually want that ongoing support and need help with that accountability or need that kind of inspiration kind of regularly. But yeah, as long as you're not doing it from a place, look, readings are there for three reasons. They're there for clarity, they're there for inspiration, and they're there for reassurance. So as long as you're finding that you're getting those from a reading, it doesn't really matter. There's no right or wrong answer. It's only when you're looking for people to make decisions for you, or, as you say, wanting somebody to reassure you on something. That there's that wonderful quote from Naomi Campbell, of all people.
Okay.
Hit me. I only mean of all people because that was slightly unexpected, not because I don't think she's full of wisdom. But she says, if you go to three people with the same problem, it's not advice you need, it's attention. Oh. And I think that's really, really, really smart. So again, it's slightly apply that to readings as well.
That was really interesting. And I hope the listeners found that interesting. I think we're going to do, basically, we're going to start a bit of a tradition at the end of our podcast. And this is the first time we're going to do it. But Fingal, for those of you that are listening and not watching on YouTube, Fingal has got a deck of tarot cards in front of him. And he's going to do a little one-card reading. Is that right? Do you want to explain a little bit about what you're going to do?
Yeah, great. So I've typically done these weekly on our Instagram. But I want to do it on the podcast as well. So I'm just going to shuffle the deck. Jamie's going to say stop whenever he feels that the time is right. And I'm just going to pull a card and give a little bit of guidance and advice and a message that is based upon that card. And take what resonates, leave what doesn't. And the great thing is, whenever you're listening to this podcast, this is a message that you may need right at this moment. So again, it doesn't matter if you resonate with the tarot or not. Maybe there's just a little gem, a little nugget in here that will spark a bit of reassurance, clarity, or inspiration, as we say.
Fab.
Cool. So I'm just going to shuffle the deck. So I'm using the trusty Rider-Waite deck. And again, we'll have to do one on the wonderful world of tarot at some point, because it's such a huge and vast subject. But Jamie, when you feel that the time is correct and right, you're just going to say stop.
Because sometimes as well, when you're shuffling the tarot deck, a card will just pop out and you know that's meant to be as well. It's not happening today. So I'm going to say stop.
Fabulous. So the card that we have is, the Five of Pentacles. The Five of Pentacles, often known as the Lord of Material Chaos, often called the Poverty card. It's an interesting one. It's one of those tarot cards that everyone's like, I don't want to get it. It's too bad. It means poverty. Because you've got two, for the interest of those that are listening on the podcast, you've got two of the characters walking in the snow barefoot, and they're standing in front of a church window, and it's snowing. And it looks quite a kind of grim and not the easiest environment to be in. But it really reminds us, the thing that always draws me is in the stained glass window, there's an anchor and the Five Pentacles there. And the anchor is about what anchors you into a sense of kind of community. The church in the card represents community, it represents tribe, it represents the sanctuary of the spiritual, really. It's basically saying, because it comes after the Four of Pentacles, which is all about financial stability and security. It's like, well, even in the times that we lose things, when we lose material things, either we lose our job, we might lose our headphones on the train, whatever it is that we feel kind of in a way robbed.
Who did that? Who lost their headphones on the train?
No, that wasn't a personal experience at all. The good thing is I dealt with that really calmly and collectively.
Really calmly.
Really enlightened being. But this card is a reminder of basically finding solace in community. It's, although we might not necessarily have financial stability or financial security in our lives, what we can always rely on is the generosity and kindness of others. So it's a little reminder to lean into that, lean into where you can develop and cultivate this sense of belonging, really. Because the card is all about self-worth. And actually, we can't control those external influences sometimes. We can't control our external world. But what we can do is always lean into, as I say, this sense of community and spirituality.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for giving us a bit of an insight into your world before and after readings, what that looks like. And hopefully the listeners will have a better understanding of what to expect if they book in for a reading, if they've never been to see you or any of us, any of the team at the Wellness Foundry. And yeah, for me, it was super interesting as well, just to hear these few other little nuggets that I will potentially pop in my little pocket and use as well. And I'm certainly going to learn the pentagon thing. That sounds like a really good way to close down.
The wiggly hands.
The wiggly hands.
Yeah, and if you've got any questions on what to expect in a reading, what happens in a reading, or anything like that, please feel free to email us or drop us a DM on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. But yes, until next time, sending lots of love and blessings.
Lots of love. Bye.
And that's the end of this week's episode. We'd love to hear what you think or suggestions on what you would like us to cover for the future. Either leave us a comment if the platform you're listening to allows it, or drop us an email, hello@wellnessfoundry.co.uk, or a DM on Instagram. Be sure to hit subscribe or follow to stay up to date with the latest releases. But until next time, love and blessings.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Spirit Level, brought to you by the Wellness Foundry, the home of spiritual wellness. For more information and bookings, visit the website wellnessfoundry.co.uk or find us on Instagram @wellnessfoundry. Don't forget, as a thank you for listening, receive 5% off your first booking by using code PODCAST5 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply.